Hello, everyone. It's just 5 minutes past 2:30. I want to welcome everyone to GGNA's webinar series focused on DonorScape today. This is, I hope everyone who's attending is healthy and safe at home in this crisis. And again, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar series, which is part of some premium content and capacity building that we are providing to our clients on an ongoing basis. So thank you again for joining. Today's topic is importing DonorScape ratings into your database. My name is Paul Mateo. I'm Vice President for Client Solutions with Grenza Bachler Associates, together along with my colleagues in Philanthropic Analytics. We're pleased to present this topic to all of you today. Just some housekeeping items. We would like to try and make this as interactive as possible. So if there are any questions throughout this, please enter your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If I'm able to address them during the presentation, I will. Otherwise, we will save them for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. With that said, I'd like to thank you for being clients of the firm. The firm has been around serving clients large and small since 1961. We serve clients across all continents in 17 countries. Many of our clients have submitted nearly 400 million records for us to analyze, and we have used that data to refine our analytics and our models in the years that we've served our clients. We have served over 100 $1 billion plus campaigns since the inception of the firm, and currently, with your help, we are managing nearly $60 billion in client campaigns and goals. So at the onset, I'd like to thank you all for being clients of the firm and your partnership with us, particularly in the areas of philanthropic analytics, but also perhaps beyond in our work as campaign counsel, both for strategic planning and feasibility studies, program reviews, and readiness assessments, as well as many of our other consulting products across annual giving, advancement services, alumni relations, and beyond. In response to several requests from our clients, including in light of this current crisis, many of you now have the bandwidth and the desire to kind of pick up some work as it relates to managing the data that we have worked on together in our DonorScape prospect analysis work. Today, we'd like to focus on taking the results of our analysis a step further and ensuring we're making the most use out of that data, particularly as it relates to your CRM or your database. Today, I'd like to discuss the ratings, codes, and other data elements that are returned as part of our engagement with you, highlight some of those elements that are most important and candidates for import back into your systems. We'll discuss in great detail some import considerations, things that you need to be thinking about, not only as administrators of the database, but also as prospect management and research professionals, as well as development and advancement leaders. We'll talk a little bit about the implications for the database itself, things to look out for. Importing in general is seemingly a simple task to accomplish, but then again, we're dealing with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of records, and we want to be good stewards of that data, not only for our existing staffs, but also in preparation for the utility of this data in the future. And then we'll go over the key import tasks, and I'll do my best to share some of the experiences that we've had across our client base around the importing of this data. And hopefully at the end of this, you'll have a clearer picture on what needs to be accomplished, how and what would need to be accomplished to successfully import this data back into your systems. At the end of this, of course, we're open to Q&A session to discuss specific questions or needs. As clients of the firm, particularly in Philanthropic Analytics, you are well underway in your utility of the DonorScape philanthropic and wealth screening application. We're bringing a lot of information into the fold for each of our client institutions, particularly around the wealth and giving capacity of individuals. By now, you've made tremendous use of this information in researching these individuals, not only on their wealth and capacity, but also around their affinity and likelihood to give. Some of you, in fact, may be using this data in your major gift campaign, of course, in your annual and deferred giving campaigns. And you are making use of all of these ratings and detailed and underlying information. Primarily, you're using the DonorScape website to sift through this information and prioritize prospects. But some of you may not have taken the next step of importing this information back into your CRM and using this information within the confines of that environment. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about why an institution might choose to import this data into the database. The first and most popular reason is to make this data accessible to stakeholders. And what I mean by that is many of you, particularly in prospect research and pipeline development roles, perhaps you are the only ones that have access to this detailed information and are the stewards of that data. The other stakeholders within the institution or organization, such as the development or advancement leadership, particularly frontline fundraisers and gift officers, may not have as direct access to the DonorScape resources in some of your environments. So expanding the accessibility of this data is key and critical in a sort of controlled and prioritized way. And so importing them into the database is one way to achieve that. You are essentially unlocking and allowing this information to be available to every single prospect record. You are having this data, again, available within the database of record, which means that it is now made part of the institutional assets and the data that we have on our prospective and current donors. We'll want to capture that into the database for not only future utility of our staffs, but the ability to capture that outside of the DonorScape application. So in the event that you perhaps no longer have access to the DonorScape tools, or that there's turnover or change in staff, there is a permanent record of the work and the time and effort and resources spent on acquiring each of this information and capturing it in the database. Even more so, there is tremendous benefit in the form of querying, reporting, and visualization, which means that this data is now queryable beyond the DonorScape website and application, and now available to be queried natively within your CRM and database. This will be alongside some critical information about your prospects and donors, such as prospect assignment, giving history, and other attributes of the prospective donors that could be used to create robust queries within your database application. Similarly, from a reporting standpoint, being able to combine the other elements within your database, again, giving histories, actions, and other pertinent prospect management data will be alongside the GG&A DonorScape ratings, both capacity to give, gift capacity ratings, as well as likelihood to give scores and other data elements that are part of your engagement with GG&A. And then lastly, you get a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of the visualization of that data within your CRM or database. You'll be able to quantify and to lay out the information that we have returned back to you, not only in our reports and such, but existing within your own data to better prioritize and plan your engagement efforts with these donors. Now, just a little bit of background in terms of the universe of elements that come back as part of a typical DonorScape engagement. And just as a reminder, many of you have engaged us for different scopes of work. So some of these will be applicable to you and others may not. But first and foremost, wealth and philanthropic ratings are part of every DonorScape, GG&A and DonorScape engagement. This information includes not only the gift capacity ratings and estimates, but also aggregate details, aggregate statistics about real estate value, stock assets, charitable and political gifts, revenues that come from public and private corporations, income for individuals, pension plans and 401ks, as well as the raw values for wealth-related elements. These are things that you might consider importing into the system from your DonorScape results. In addition to the capacity and wealth and philanthropic activity, many of you have engaged us for predictive analytics and predictive modeling. Those ratings include things like likelihood to make a major gift or major gift ratings, annual giving ratings with guidance for unrestricted and restricted annual recurring gifts, as well as a rating for deferred giving or gift planning. These elements are equally as important to the wealth and philanthropic data I mentioned previously, and are also things to consider importing to the database to maximize the utility of your DonorScape results. Similarly, many of you have engaged us to append and enhance your data files and prospect lists with external demographics and other indicators. Demographics such as age, date of birth, gender, marital status, presence of children in the home, household income, home market value, and the ever so popular PRIZM segmentation are also potentially part of your result set with GG&A DonorScape. These elements have more complex considerations as it relates to importing them into the database, and I'll discuss that in more detail. But again, these are additional options for you to consider importing back into the system if you have engaged us to receive this information. Addresses and contact information. If you have participated in an address cleansing or address hygiene and contact information updates, these include the national change of address, address enhancement and updates, as well as any updated phone and email contact information are also candidates for import back into the system. Again, there are more considerations with this third-party data, and I'll be discussing that in the import considerations section in just a few minutes. And then lastly, detailed underlying information. I would consider this essentially in the advanced category for those of you who are doing advanced queries amongst the data that we have supplied as part of our engagement. These things might include charitable giving details. These are gifts to other 501c3s or nonprofits, being able to mine that information and import that data into the system for specific tagging or attributes. Specific real estate parcels or the details behind the actual real estate parcel can also be imported into the system. Detailed biographies, as well as company SIC or category codes. SIC stands for Standard Industry Code, and the NAICS is the North American version of industry codes, where you could import the detailed industry code into your database and use that to mine for a specific campaign. An example of that might be looking for executives that are employees of a corporation that is involved in the environment or in the automotive industry, or whatever the case might be, that could be useful to you in terms of prospecting and prospect identification. Now, many of you would like to import everything into the database. And while that is certainly possible and feasible to do, I would argue that with limited resources and time, we would like to focus on the most important ratings to be imported into the system. As it relates to wealth and philanthropic ratings, the firm is very strong on importing the most important components, particularly the gift capacity ratings. For predictive analytics and predictive modeling, the most important elements are the likelihood to make a major gift, as well as the annual and gift planning segments. And then among the demographics and other indicators, income, home value, and PRIZM are particularly important for continuing to segment the database beyond wealth and likelihood, looking for individuals who might perform well in direct response or direct mail campaigns, looking for individuals that are good for acquisition or reactivation. If you were able to just import the items here in blue, you would be far ahead of the curve or far ahead of the pack as it relates to integrating the results and the data that we've spent so much time and energy crafting on your behalf. Now, you're familiar with the gift capacity ratings, which is a hallmark of the GGNA DonorScape application. We have a rating figure here associated with a gift capacity estimate, which is derived from all of the economic indicators in each of our 14 data sources available to you as part of your DonorScape subscription. Those of you who are very familiar with this will know that the ratings themselves may change and can be adjusted based on match accuracy. And this is just one example of the considerations that you'll need to take into account when importing this information back into the database. Being able to properly label and indicate the definitions in the system is going to go a long way in terms of having your stakeholders understand the data that's being imported or has been imported, and being able to understand the source of this information, again, is critical beyond just importing the actual values into the database tables. As part of this webinar, we will be sending you some key documentation that will aid in importing this information back into the database or CRM. The first resource that I'd like to point your attention to is the DonorScape Guide to Ratings and Codes. The hyperlink here is included in this slide deck. I'm just going to click on that hyperlink and show you that resource. This is available on the web. And this resource gives you the rating definitions for the most pertinent ratings for import. It'll give you the gift capacity ratings and the definition, the major gift ratings and the definition, guidance around annual giving and gift planning, and then the detailed information around PRIZM segment codes if you have engaged GGNA to provide that on your behalf. In addition to that resource, We have a number of other key documentation that could be pertinent to you in your work. For those of you who are Razor's Edge clients, for example, we have a Razor's Edge import guide that will guide you specifically around the unique data structures within Blackbaud's Razor's Edge database and software, guiding you not only from the collection of the data to be imported, but all the way through the import steps of creating a test plan and importing that data into the system. I'll take a preview of that, that resource now. My apologies, 1 second. The Razor's Edge import guide will guide you into using the prospect tab, for example, or the attributes tab within attributes function within Razor's Edge to tag and code each of the prospect records and entity records with the DonorScape information. Again, it is a step-by-step guide in terms of identifying the data structures and the fields, as well as creating exception files and output queries to make sure that you are importing the right information and not making any errors or mistakes as it relates to the prospect information. In addition, for those of you who are not on Razor's Edge but use, for example, the Ellucian Advanced CRMs, for those of you that are on Advanced 9.5 or later, there's a Advanced Web Integration Reference Guide where the DonorScape import is built into the advanced systems, making it very easy for you to use this information and import them back into the system once you've received an export file from the DonorScape application. For those of you that are interested in either of these, please let us know and we'll forward copies of this to you shortly after the call. Lastly, for some of you who may be on Tessitura for our performing arts clients, there are also some guides around using the tabs within Tessitura to provide a view into the DonorScape ratings within the Tessitura application. Now, as it relates to import considerations, we've collected a number of insights from our work with clients doing this over the several past few decades. The first piece of advice that I would give all of you is don't be a digital pack rat, right? Import only what you will use. There are a number of considerations when importing this data around data storage and cluttering the database with information that may not be priority for your institution to use. So just because the data is available and you have paid for it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be important or critical to import into the system. You'll notice that I mentioned things like aggregate values for wealth and capacity, things like aggregate totals of stock holdings and aggregate totals of charitable contributions. Ask yourself if you really need that level of detail beyond just the gift capacity ratings imported into the system. Again, the considerations there is if it's not being used or does not plan to be used in a meaningful way moving forward, there's no reason to import it back into the system. Number two, think about the shelf life of this data. Be aware of that. Typically for wealth ratings, they kind of have a shelf life of about a year. Lots of things can change, including in economic crises such as this one, that a wealth rating could be different 12 months from now. And so when you're importing this data into the system, let's be sure that we are tagging that rating with a specific date, and knowing that beyond that time frame, we will need to consider either refreshing or updating that data into the system. So key takeaway of this particular point is tag the data with the date that the rating was assigned or that the screening was performed. Similarly, with modeling ratings, they have about a shelf life of 3 years, maybe less, depending on the activity at our client institutions. So I would urge you again to tag every single record with a specific rating date to allow you to be aware of the shelf life of those ratings. Number 3, and this one is really important to me, and given some recent experience I've had with our clients, is make sure you're adhering to your data governance policies. And what I mean by that is don't simply import this data straight away. As it relates to ratings like gift capacity and major giving likelihood and affinity ratings, there's little risk in importing those into the system. Their guidance, those are derived from GGNA's expertise. But as it relates to address updates or demographic elements, what you don't want to do is overwrite good data. And what I've seen some of our clients do is import addresses and overwrite good addresses with updated addresses where a donor or prospect does not expect to receive mail. So be careful about each donor's preferences as it relates to that, and make sure if you do not happen to have a data governance policy in place, that you create some guidelines around importing third-party information so that we're preserving the information in the system as best we can. Which isn't to say that the data is not trustworthy, but again, we are dealing with third-party information, and the data that is being stewarded and managed by our respective client institutions, we've spent a lot of time and energy curating that data and making sure it's accurate. So let's not undo any of that information as it relates to wholesale import of data. Number 4 is to use the most commonly accepted fields for this data or data containers. Those of you who are on Razor's Edge will kind of understand what I mean. There are many places to store rating information. For example, the most popular is the prospect tab within Razor's Edge. Some of our client institutions did not subscribe or pay for that particular module with Blackbaud, and therefore they need other means or systems to capture that information outside of the prospect tab. Many of you on Razor's Edge would have to default, for example, to the attributes or constituent code data within Razor's Edge, which is okay and fine, but let's make sure that we have followed the guidelines around your particular CRMs for the best places to store that information, particularly paying attention to the data types and the kinds of information that can be captured within these fields. Additional examples include things like financial information, phone numbers, emails, demographics. Let's make sure that we're not importing them into parts of the application that could cause confusion for staffs in the future. Another thing that I would ask you to consider is having foresight on how the data will be consumed in the future. Again, that's things like what I mentioned before around dates, being able to code the source of your ratings, in this case, GGNA and DonorScape, as well as when the ratings were completed or processed, would give our future colleagues a means to evaluate the data that's in the system when the time comes. Labeling the data carefully and distributing guides around the information and how you've imported it into the system is critical for success. Importing just a rating and no indication of how it might be used or what the definition of those ratings are will only cause confusion and will make the import process really a waste of time. So be sure to think about that in your pre-import conversations and your pre-import plan about how to indicate the utility of the ratings and the data in the system as best you can for you yourself, your colleagues, and the rest of the stakeholders. Now, in terms of database considerations, there are a number of things. I'll try and use some examples from those of you attendees that I've seen which institutions you're coming from. In terms of Razor's Edge, again, consider the locations and the containers for importing this information. The most common, again, are the prospect tab, the financial information tab, constituent codes, and contact information. I would consider actions not necessarily being the most appropriate place to store that information. For our Ellucian Advance clients, the evaluations table within most of your implementations are the most logical place to store ratings. You have a lot of options as it relates to coding and tagging the ratings themselves, in addition to the source and the date. There are even start and stop dates, for example, within Advance to give you an opportunity to understand the shelf life, for example, for these ratings. For those of you that are considering a data warehouse, you can import a flat file of all of these ratings into your data warehouse systems. That is something that you can download directly from the DonorScape website or just get in touch with any of our GGNA support personnel through support@donorscape.com, and we're happy to talk through your options for capturing this in a data warehouse. For our Tessitura clients, we can bring to bear some resources and some of your colleagues in other performing arts organizations to help you think about additional considerations as it relates to Tessitura specifically. So if you're interested in that, please let us know either through the Q&A or through emailing me directly at the contact information slide at the end of this presentation. Additionally, the DonorScape offers a utility called Direct Link, which is a hyperlink that is coded specifically to your client institution to access the results of a single individual prospect, which means that from your respective systems, you can be looking at a donor or prospect record, click on this link, and without having to log into the DonorScape application, be able to see the detailed ratings information. It is an alternative to importing the detailed information into the system, thereby saving some storage and some time around putting specific values and ratings into your database tables, and giving you a live view into the DonorScape application. There are some benefits to doing that above and beyond saving some database storage and space on your database systems, but it does rely on, it does require you to have a live internet connection to be able to see that information. For those of you attending this webinar, please let us know if you are interested in that, and we're happy to provide some additional information. As it relates to hosting, there are some considerations there as well. Some of you will have on-prem or on-premises installations of your database and CRM, and as it relates to just the amount of time that it takes to import tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of records, you'll want to consider your hosting limitations. Some of you that have Blackbaud's Razor's Edge may be hosted by Blackbaud, and there could be some limitations on your ability to import that in a short amount of time. Things like your client web client disconnecting after a period of inactivity, or there being specific limitations on the number of records that could be imported through that process. That's just one example, but do consider where your database is hosted when you're thinking about importing this information, the DonorScape information, back into the system. Similarly with storage, again, storage is generally inexpensive, but for those of you who have specific covenants or requirements with your database vendor, will want to consider how much information you are consuming for these ratings. Generally speaking, these are light and fairly small in terms of the actual data consumed, but I did want to make sure that as part of your database considerations, you're taking that into account. The last two around database considerations involve data security and permissions. What I mean by data security is make sure that the information that you're importing back is accessible only to those who need access to that information. I'm speaking directly to our healthcare clients, for which we have ratings on patients, and we need to adhere to specific HIPAA guidelines for information as it relates to prospects who have health information or PHI associated with it. So please do consider who will have access to the ratings and create the appropriate permissions and categories for those end users and groups. Now to summarize the key import tasks. First, you'll need to gather or download the ratings and data elements. It is very easy as a self-service function within the DonorScape application to do that. I'll demonstrate that at the end of this call. In addition, you are welcome to get in touch with your DonorScape representative or to the DonorScape support team at support@donorscape.com, and we will help you gather these materials for import back. Step two is to make sure you have a good plan for mapping all of the elements and storing them within your database, paying particular attention to labels and your naming schemes that are appropriate for how your end users would expect them to appear and to adhere to your own internal nomenclature. Make sure you consider all of the database considerations that we discussed on the previous slide, noting any particular exceptions or any hurdles that we need to overcome prior to import. And then lastly is a test import or validation sample. You can reduce the total number of prospects that you're going to import back into the system into just a few dozen or even a dozen examples, so that you can import that test sample, go into the prospect or donor record, and validate that the import worked and that all of the information is captured in the appropriate spots. And then finally, you're well on your way to doing probably the easiest part of this process, which is the import. Even amongst our Razor's Edge clients with hundreds of thousands of records in their database, that import could just take a few hours one evening to accomplish. So again, the full or final import is probably the easiest step in this entire process for import. I'm just going to demonstrate how to download your results from the DonorScape application, and then I will open it up for some questions. Please go ahead and submit them to the Q&A at this time while I switch screens here into the DonorScape application. For the DonorScape application, in terms of capturing the import data or export data, you'll want to navigate to the Prospects tab. In the Prospects tab, you will apply the appropriate filters to get to the population that you desire. In many cases, you'll be able to you won't have to apply any filters whatsoever and be able to download the full population or the full existing population of prospects. Simply click on the download prospects button to select all of the elements that you'd like to include in your export file. Once you've selected those elements, simply hit the download prospects button and a request processing button will appear. Depending on the size of your export, this could take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours. So please go back and check that this button is completed processing and that file will be ready for download. I'm going to give, I'll pause for a few minutes for any questions for this question and answer session that follows this. Again, please feel free to submit your questions and we will answer them as best we can. Okay, it appears that we have a number of questions here. In the interest of time, what I will do is respond to you directly, as well as include this information in a blog post for all of you who have participated today, in case these questions are pertinent to your individual institutions. I want to thank everyone for joining today. I appreciate the time to join this and your confidence in the firm. I wish everyone a safe and healthy time in this crisis. Please do reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you.